The call came on a Sunday morning in November, while I was making pancakes. Not the call I expected. Not the kind of call you brace for. The ordinary Sunday kind. Someone needing something, a scheduling question, a reminder about a family dinner. I had flour on my hands and the radio was on low and the kitchen smelled of butter in a hot pan. And I picked up the phone without looking at the screen because my hands were occupied and my mind was elsewhere and nothing in my life had yet given me a reason to be careful about which calls I answered. "Thomas," said the voice on the other end. "It's Carol. Have you heard from Diane? I've been trying to reach her since Friday." Carol, my mother-in-law, calling to ask where her daughter was. Her daughter, who had told me she was spending the weekend at Carol's house. "Hello, everyone. My name is Thomas, and I'm 42 years old. I work as a civil engineer for a regional infrastructure firm. Bridges, drainage systems, the unglamorous but necessary architecture that holds a city together beneath its surface. I've been doing it for 16 years. I am, by most measures, a methodical and patient man. I read specifications carefully. I don't rush load calculations. I understand that the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is often a single overlooked variable in an otherwise complete design. I had been married to Diane for 13 years. We had 2 children. Noah, who was 11 and had recently become seriously interested in astronomy, sleeping with a star chart on his desk and asking questions about light years that I couldn't always answer. And Sophie, who was 8 and approached the world with the creative certainty of someone who has already decided what matters and is simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. Diane was 39. She managed client relations for a mid-sized architecture firm, a job that suited her particular gift for making people feel heard, for navigating the complicated emotional terrain between what clients wanted and what was actually buildable. She was warm, socially intelligent, professionally admired. She was, in the vocabulary I used without examining it, the person I trusted most completely. I stood in the kitchen with the phone to my ear and flour on my hands and Carol's question settling into the room like something that had changed the air pressure. "She left Friday morning," I said carefully. "She said she was coming to you." A pause. The specific pause of someone recalibrating what they thought they knew. "Thomas," Carol said, "I haven't seen Diane since last month." The butter in the pan was beginning to brown. I turned off the burner. I set the phone on the counter and looked at the kitchen. The ordinary Sunday kitchen, the children's drawings on the refrigerator, the star chart Noah had left on the table, the half-measured bowl of batter, and understood that something in the architecture of my life had just revealed a flaw I hadn't known to look for. I picked up the phone. "Carol," I said, "I'm sure there's an explanation. Let me call her and I'll get back to you." I called Diane. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the specific texture of someone slightly breathless, slightly recalibrated. The voice of a person who has just been handed a situation they need to manage. "Hey," she said. "What's up?" "Your mother just called me," I said. "She's wondering where you are." 3 seconds of silence. 3 seconds that told me more than the next hour of conversation would. "Oh," she said. I meant to call her. I ended up staying with Natalie instead." "I should have." "That's fine," I said. "I'll let her know." I ended the call and stood in the kitchen and thought about the 3 seconds, and the Sunday after that was the last ordinary Sunday I would have for a long time. Thomas introduces himself as a civil engineer, a man whose professional identity is built around the detection of structural flaws before they become catastrophic failures. The irony established in the opening section is precise and deliberate. The man most trained to identify hidden weaknesses in complex systems has been living inside one without applying his professional instincts to it. Carol's phone call is the story's initiating crack, not the discovery itself, but the first visible fracture in a surface Thomas had believed was load-bearing. The 3 seconds of silence when Diane hears that Carol has called are the section's most psychologically significant detail. Not guilt, exactly, but the specific pause of a person rapidly assessing damage and selecting a response. Thomas registers this pause with the part of his mind that reads structural anomalies, and the registration, quiet, unannounced, filed without immediate action, is the beginning of everything that follows. The domestic setting, flour on hands, butter browning, children's drawings on the refrigerator, establishes the specific texture of what is at stake. Not an abstract marriage but a particular and inhabited life, full of star charts and pancake batter and the ordinary Sunday machinery of a family that believes itself intact. Let me go back 3 months because the Sunday phone call was not the beginning. It was the moment the beginning became visible. August. The kitchen still smelled of summer. The basil plant on the sill that Diane replaced every few weeks. The particular warmth of afternoons that came through the back windows and lay across the floor in long rectangles. We had been married 13 years and the marriage had the texture of something that had settled into its own shape. Not the high-voltage early years, not the difficult middle period when the children were small and sleep-deprived and everything required more than we had, but something quieter and more durable, I believed, the settled weight of a life built together and inhabited without drama. Diane had always visited her mother regularly. Carol lived 40 minutes away, a capable and independent woman in her late 60s who gardened obsessively and called twice a week, and who had the specific relationship with Diane of a mother and daughter who had negotiated their closeness into something functional and affectionate. The visits happened every few weeks, a Saturday or Sunday, sometimes an overnight, never anything that required explanation or produced concern. In August, the visits began to increase. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself as significant. Once a month became twice, became 3 times in September, became what appeared to be every other weekend by October. I noted this in the way you note a change in routine, with mild curiosity, without alarm. Diane's explanations were consistent. Carol's garden project required help. Carol had been having some joint pain and needed assistance with certain tasks. Carol simply enjoyed the company and Diane felt she should be there more. All of it was plausible. All of it was the kind of thing a devoted daughter does. The first thing I noticed that didn't fit the explanation was small enough that I nearly missed it. In late August, I drove past Carol's house on a Saturday afternoon. Not deliberately, simply the most direct route between a hardware store and home, and Diane's car was not in the driveway. She had told me she was there. I told myself she had parked on the street, or had taken Carol somewhere, or any of the half-dozen ordinary explanations that a passing observation doesn't disprove. I drove home and said nothing, but I noticed. The phone behavior arrived in September. Again, not dramatic, not the obvious privacy of someone with something to hide, but something more controlled than that. A new habit of carrying her phone rather than leaving it on surfaces. A new practice of taking it upstairs when she went to bed rather than charging it in the kitchen as she had done for years. Once, in the kitchen, she was reading something that produced a brief, private smile, the involuntary kind, the kind that arrives before the decision to have it, and when she looked up and found me watching, the smile was folded away with a practiced smoothness that left her expression entirely neutral. I thought about the smile for 2 days. My colleague and friend James noticed something before I did, or rather, said what I hadn't yet been willing to say to myself. We were having lunch in late September, the kind of lunch colleagues have when the subject is officially work and unofficially everything else, and he said, "How are things at home?" "Fine," I said. "Good." He looked at me the way people look at you when they've decided not to push but want you to know they'd listen if you did. "You've seemed preoccupied lately." "Work," I said. He accepted this as a good friend accepts an incomplete answer fully and without believing it. The children provided the section's deepest signal, as children often do, without understanding what they were transmitting. Noah asked me in early October in his careful, astronomical way, the way of a boy who approaches questions by calculating their distance before asking them, whether Mom had a new friend. I asked him what he meant. He said that she'd been on the phone a lot and she laughed differently sometimes. I asked him how she laughed differently. He thought about it and said, "Like she's trying not to." I told him I didn't know about a new friend, but I'd ask her. I didn't ask her. I held Noah's observation instead, the way you hold a measurement that doesn't fit your current model, and I thought about what it meant that an 11-year-old had identified something his father was still negotiating with himself about whether to name. Something was off. The texture of the daily life was the same, but underneath it something had shifted in a way I couldn't yet locate, and the difficulty of locating it was beginning to feel less like insufficient evidence and more like the specific resistance of a man who wasn't ready to find what was there. The most psychologically acute observations in Part 2 come not from Thomas, who is still inside the architecture of motivated reasoning, but from the peripheral characters around him. James, the colleague, identifies preoccupation that Thomas is officially attributing to work. Noah, 11 years old and equipped with the unfiltered observational precision of a child, identifies that his mother laughs differently, like she's trying not to. A description so exact it could not have been produced by an adult already invested in a particular interpretation. The missed car in Carol's driveway is the section's most structurally significant detail. Thomas drives past, notes the absence, generates the available innocent explanations, drives on, and says nothing. This is not negligence but the specific behavior of someone who has understood, at some level, that following this thread will lead somewhere he is not yet equipped to go. Diane's smile, involuntary, immediately folded away, is the section's most intimate signal. Genuine feeling, briefly visible, rapidly concealed. The concealment is practiced rather than startled, which means it has been rehearsed. Thomas has enough data by the end of October to form a hypothesis. What he lacks is not evidence but the willingness to let the hypothesis be the thing he is actually investigating. October deepened and the investigation, which I was not yet calling an investigation, deepened with it. I want to be precise about the timeline because precision matters to me professionally, and I found, during this period, that it mattered personally too. The dates, the patterns, the accumulation of small anomalies. I kept these in my head with the same methodical attention I brought structural load calculations, because organizing information was the only way I knew how to manage the specific anxiety of knowing something was wrong without knowing what it was. The weekend visits to Carol's had settled into a pattern. Friday evening departure, Sunday evening return. Every other weekend, sometimes 2 weekends in a row. Each time Diane packed a bag. Nothing unusual in the bag. Nothing that announced a different destination. The ordinary overnight contents of a woman visiting her mother. Each time she was affectionate before she left. A kiss, a reminder about Noah's Saturday chess club, a note about what was in the refrigerator for the weekend. Each time she returned slightly recalibrated. Not tired in the way of someone who has been managing an elderly parent's needs, but resettled, the specific quality of a person transitioning between two contexts. I called Carol in the first week of October. Not to check. I told myself I was calling to say hello, to maintain the relationship, to be the attentive son-in-law I generally tried to be. We talked for 20 minutes about her garden and Noah's astronomy phase and Sophie's school project. Carol mentioned that she hadn't seen much of Diane lately. Said it lightly, without agenda, in the tone of a mother who missed her daughter and was simply noting it. She was there a couple of weekends ago, I said. Was she? Carol said. I must be losing track. The weeks run together. I let the conversation move on. But Carol's uncertainty sat in me differently from Diane's absence from the driveway in August, because Carol was precise. A woman who tracked her garden's progress in a notebook, who knew exactly when each variety of rose had been planted and when it had last been pruned. Carol did not lose track of when she'd seen her daughter. The red herring arrived in mid-October, and it was convincing enough that I held onto it for nearly 3 weeks. Diane mentioned over dinner that she'd been meeting with a life coach. She said it with the slight self-consciousness of someone sharing something personal. She'd been feeling stuck professionally, she said, wanting to think through some career questions, and a colleague had recommended someone who'd helped her think through similar questions. She'd been keeping it quiet because she wasn't sure how she felt about it yet and didn't want to discuss it until she had something to say. The sessions were on Fridays, which explained some of the Friday early departures. The emotional processing explained the phone behavior. She was working through things she wasn't ready to share. It was entirely plausible. It was the kind of thing Diane would do, thoughtful, self-aware, private about her internal work until she had conclusions to offer. I accepted it with a relief that was slightly larger than the evidence warranted, which should have told me something about how much I needed an innocent explanation. I held the life coach explanation for 3 weeks. Then James said something that dismantled it. We were working late in the office, the building mostly empty, the particular companionship of 2 people finishing something after hours. He said carefully, "Has Diane mentioned anything about a colleague of hers named Daniel Marsh?" I looked at him. "No." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment, the quiet of someone deciding how much to say. "I ran into someone who knows people at her firm. They mentioned his name in a context that..." He stopped. "I might be wrong. I probably am. But I thought you should have the name." "What context?" I said. The kind you'd want to know about, he said. I'm sorry, Thomas. I don't have more than that. I drove home that evening with Daniel Marsh's name in my head and the life coach explanation dissolving around it. Not because the name proved anything, but because James was not a man who offered incomplete information without sufficient reason. And the reason he had was sufficient enough that he'd been carrying it and deciding whether to share it for long enough to make him careful. I looked up Daniel Marsh that evening. He was a senior project manager at Diane's firm. Mid-40s, based in the same office, worked on the client relations side. His professional profile was entirely ordinary. His photograph showed a man who looked like someone you'd trust with a complicated renovation. Calm, competent, presentable. I looked at it for a long time and felt the specific sensation of a man whose structural model has just been shown to be missing a load-bearing element he hadn't accounted for. The following Friday, instead of staying late at work, I came home at 4 o'clock and parked 2 streets away and sat in my car and waited. Diane left the house at 5:15 with a weekend bag. She did not drive toward Carol's house. The chain of causation in Part 3 operates through a series of small decisions, each producing a consequence that narrows Thomas's available interpretations. Carol's precise uncertainty, she doesn't lose track of visits and she sounds uncertain, is the first link. It transforms the August driveway observation from a single data point into a pattern. The life coach explanation is the chain's most interesting link because it is the one that temporarily breaks it. Thomas accepts the explanation not because it is fully convincing but because acceptance is available and the alternative costs more. When James offers Daniel Marsh's name, the chain resumes with new momentum. Not because the name is proof, but because James's deliberate, careful delivery of it signals that James has already done the probability calculation and found the result significant. Thomas's decision to come home early on Friday and park 2 streets away is the chain's most consequential link. It is the moment passive suspicion becomes active investigation, and active investigation, once begun, cannot be stopped by an innocent explanation, only by a definitive one. Diane's departure with a weekend bag, driving in the wrong direction, is not yet proof. But it is the end of the chain's phase of deniability. I followed her. I want to be honest about this the way I've tried to be honest about everything else. I followed my wife's car on a Friday evening in late October, maintaining enough distance to stay invisible, and I felt, while doing it, simultaneously like a man doing what the situation required and like a man I wouldn't have recognized a year earlier. Both things were true. I held them both without resolving them and kept driving. She drove 40 minutes in a direction that was not Carol's house. She parked outside a block of service apartments in a part of the city I knew from infrastructure work. A new development recently completed, the kind of building where units were rented by the week or the month, furnished, anonymous, practical. She took her bag from the boot and walked to the entrance with the ease of someone who had done this before and had stopped thinking about it as significant. I sat outside for 2 hours. Then I drove home. I didn't confront her. Not yet. What I had was observation, not evidence, and I was enough of an engineer to understand the difference between a witnessed anomaly and a confirmed fault. I needed more. Over the following 10 days, I built the case with the methodical patience of someone who has decided that speed matters less than accuracy. I accessed our joint bank account and reviewed 3 months of transactions, something I had the legitimate right to do and had simply not been doing because the shared account had never given me reason for scrutiny. What I found: regular charges to a restaurant I didn't recognize, in a neighborhood adjacent to the serviced apartments, every other Friday evening. A charge to an online florist in September. Flowers I had not received and had no memory of seeing in the house. 2 charges to the same apartment booking platform, both on the 1st of the month for the previous 2 months. I cross-referenced the apartment charges with Diane's stated visits to Carol. The dates aligned. Every time. I found Daniel Marsh's professional email through his firm's contact page and his name in a thread Diane had accidentally left open on the shared family laptop. A chain that began professionally and became something else over the course of several weeks, the warmth increasing incrementally in the way of 2 people who have convinced themselves each individual step is small enough to be defensible. Sophia provided the moment that I didn't expect from that direction. She came to me on a Wednesday evening with a drawing she'd made. She was always drawing, always producing the specific art of a child who uses paper to process what language can't yet reach. She showed me the drawing and said, "This is our family." I looked at it. 4 figures carefully rendered in her particular style. Herself, Noah, Me. The fourth figure was positioned slightly apart from the other three, facing a different direction. "Who's that?" I said, pointing to the fourth. "That's Mummy," she said. "She's looking at something else." I thanked her for showing me, and she went back to her room, and I sat with the drawing for a long time and thought about what it means when an 8-year-old captures in crayon what an adult has been spending months negotiating with himself about whether to name. The final confirmation came from Natalie, Diane's closest friend, a woman I had always liked for her directness and who, I discovered, had been carrying the weight of what she knew for longer than was fair to ask of a person. I called her on a Thursday morning, from the car, parked outside my office. I told her what I knew. There was a silence on her end that confirmed, before she spoke, that the silence was not the silence of someone processing unexpected information. "Thomas," she said, "I've wanted to call you so many times." "How long?" I said. "Since June," she said. "I found out in June. She made me promise. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. 5 months. Since June." I thanked Natalie and ended the call and sat in the car and looked at the steering wheel and understood, with the specific clarity of a man who has finally confirmed the structural failure he'd been calculating for weeks, that the bridge I'd believed was sound had been compromised for longer than I'd known to measure. I called Eleanor Moss, a family lawyer recommended by a colleague, that afternoon. I told her I needed to understand my options. She told me what I needed to have in order, and I spent the next 48 hours quietly getting it in order. Then I called Diane and told her to come home. Thomas's investigation is driven by the specific emotional state of a man who has moved past the phase of not wanting to know and into the phase of needing to know with sufficient certainty to act. The decision to follow Diane, accompanied by the dual self-awareness of doing what the situation requires and being someone I wouldn't have recognized a year ago, reflects the moral complexity of investigation within a marriage. The recognition that the action is ethically ambiguous and the execution of it anyway, because the alternative is continued ignorance of something that is already changing the architecture of the life he inhabits. The bank statements and the laptop thread are the investigation's rational core, but it is Sophia's drawing that is the section's emotional center. The 8-year-old's crayon rendering of a mother facing away from the family is the most precise summary of what Thomas has been observing for months, stripped of all adult qualification and delivered with the complete neutrality of a child who is simply recording what she sees. Natalie's confirmation, "I've wanted to call you so many times," introduces the story's secondary betrayal, the friend who knew and kept the promise she shouldn't have made, who carried the weight of someone else's secret at the cost of someone else's peace. Thomas's response to Natalie, gratitude rather than anger, is psychologically consistent with a man who has been building toward certainty and has now achieved it, and whose emotional resources are organized around what comes next rather than the accumulation of grievances. Diane came home on a Friday evening with her weekend bag already packed, as if she'd expected to be going somewhere. She put the bag down in the hallway when she saw my face, and something in her own face reorganized into the careful neutrality of a person who has been expecting a version of this moment and is assessing how much has arrived. The children were at my mother's. I had arranged this with a calm I was still surprised to have access to. We sat in the living room, the same living room where we had made decisions together for 13 years, about mortgages and school districts and what color to paint the walls, and I put my phone on the table between us with the bank statement photographs displayed, and I told her what I knew, and I told her how I knew it, and I watched her face work through its available responses. "Thomas, don't start with my name," I said. "Start with when." A long pause. "June," she said. 5 months. "Yes." "Daniel Marsh." She looked at her hands. "Yes." The room was very quiet. The heating hummed. Outside, the November street was empty and dark, the specific dark of a Friday evening when most people are inside with their ordinary Fridays. "Why Carol?" I said. "Why use your mother?" She looked up. "I didn't think." She stopped. "I thought she'd cover for me if you called. She doesn't know. I used it because it was easy, and I thought. You thought I trusted it too completely to question it," I said. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. "I want to understand something," I said. "Not the affair. I'll deal with the affair. I want to understand why. If things were wrong between us, if something was missing, why this rather than a conversation?" She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice had the quality of someone who has been rehearsing an explanation and has decided, in this moment, to set the rehearsed version aside and try the true one. Because I didn't know how to tell you that I was lonely without it sounding like an accusation. Because you are careful and methodical and you'd have wanted to fix it like a problem, and I didn't want to be fixed. I wanted to be... She stopped. I wanted someone to understand what I was feeling without me having to explain it in a way that made sense. I sat with this. And he did that. Yes, she said. For a while. For a while, I repeated. It's not. It isn't what I want to be doing. I know that doesn't help. It doesn't, I said. But I believe you. This seemed to pain her more than anger would have. She looked at the table. I want to try, she said. Counseling. I want to end it and try. I looked at her. 13 years. The kitchen with the basil plant. Noah's star charts. Sophie's drawings. The weight of all of it was real and present in the room, and I felt it honestly rather than pretending it wasn't there. I know you mean that, I said. I believe you mean it. What I don't know is whether meaning it is sufficient. She didn't say anything. I need some time, I said. You should know I've spoken to a lawyer. Not because I've decided, because I needed to understand my options. I'm going to take the time I need to make the right decision. And I'm going to make it for Noah and Sophie as much as for myself. She nodded. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying in the performed way. She was simply wet-eyed. The way people are when something is genuinely happening to them. Where will you sleep? She said. Upstairs, I said. In the guest room. For now. I stood and picked up my phone and left the room and climbed the stairs in the quiet house and closed the guest room door behind me and lay in the dark and thought about bridges. About the difference between a bridge that has been damaged and can be reinforced and a bridge where the damage has reached the foundational elements. About how you make that determination. About what evidence you need and what the evidence, once gathered, requires of you. I didn't sleep much, but I thought clearly, which in some ways was more useful. The confrontation scene is defined by Thomas's studied control. Not the performance of calm, but the actual achievement of it, grounded in weeks of preparation and the specific psychological state of a man who has processed enough of the shock to be present rather than overwhelmed. Diane's explanation, that she was lonely, that she wanted to be understood without having to explain herself in a way that made sense, that she didn't want to be fixed, is psychologically precise and represents the story's most honest account of how the marriage failed. Not through malice, but through the gap between what Thomas's nature offered, methodical care, problem-solving, structural reliability, and what Diane needed at a particular moment, feeling rather than fixing. Her admission that, it isn't what I want to be doing, present tense, is the confrontation's most psychologically complex detail. It suggests the affair has already begun to cost her something she hadn't fully calculated when it started. Thomas's response, I believe you mean it. What I don't know is whether meaning it is sufficient, is the scene's most mature exchange, because it refuses both the easy anger of rejection and the easy comfort of immediate acceptance. The bridge metaphor, which Thomas returns to in the guest room, is structurally perfect for his character. He is literally applying his professional framework to his personal crisis, asking the engineer's question, reinforcement or replacement, about his own marriage. This is not avoidance, but the specific way this man processes what is most important to him. It's been 9 months since the Friday in November when Diane came home and found my face in the hallway and set her bag down. I want to tell you where things are, honestly and without the tidiness that stories sometimes impose on outcomes that are actually more complicated. I did not file for divorce immediately. I took the time I said I would take. 6 weeks of living in the guest room, of quiet parallel domesticity, of long walks in the early mornings when the city was thin and cold, and the decision I was carrying had room to be examined without the pressure of the day around it. I spoke to Eleanor Moss twice more. I sat with the question of the bridge, reinforcement or replacement, with the same methodical patience I brought to professional problems, which meant I didn't rush it and I didn't let anyone else's timeline become mine. In January, I told Diane I was filing. Not because the anger had won. I want to be clear about this. I am not an angry man by nature, and the anger I'd felt had moved through its stages and arrived some quieter and more durable, the specific sadness of a man who has understood something true about a situation and accepted its implications. I filed because the honest answer to the bridge question, when I finally had it, was replacement. Because what rebuilding would have required, the years of reconstruction, the specific vigilance of a man monitoring a structure he'd once trusted completely, was not a way of living I could sustain with integrity. Not for Diane, not for myself, not for Noah and Sophie, who deserved parents who were fully present in whatever life they were actually living rather than partially present in a managed reconstruction of the one that had failed. Diane accepted this. Her acceptance had the quality of a woman who had known, at some level, that this was the more honest outcome, and who was grieving it genuinely rather than performing grief. The custody arrangement was built around the children entirely. Equal time, consistent schedule, 2 addresses that were stable and warm and reliable. Noah takes his star charts to both houses. Sophie has established art supply kingdoms at each location, managed with the territorial precision of an 8-year-old who has decided that 2 studios are better than 1. They are, as best I can tell, going to be okay, not undamaged but functional and loved, and in possession of parents who have demonstrated that it is possible to make devastating decisions without destroying the people around you. James came over every Sunday for the first 3 months. He brought beer and opinions and the specific companionship of someone who tells you the truth without needing you to thank him for it. I am grateful for him in a way I haven't fully articulated and probably don't need to. I started running in February. I had not previously been a runner, had not thought of myself as someone who needed the particular discipline of early mornings and cold pavements and the physical demand that quiets the mental loop. But I found that 30 minutes at 6 o'clock, the neighborhood still dark and largely unoccupied, provided a version of myself I hadn't had regular access to. A version that was simply present in his own body, moving through the world, not calculating anything. I met Catherine April through James's expanding social orbit. A coincidence James denies engineering, which I don't believe for a moment. She was 40, a landscape ecologist, quiet in a way that had substance rather than reservation. We talked at a dinner party for 2 hours about infrastructure and ecological corridors and whether the urban planning decisions made now would be legible to the people living with their consequences in 50 years. She had views on this that were different from mine and more interesting than my own, which I found, after the specific isolation of the preceding months, genuinely enlivening. We've had dinner 3 times. The conversations have the quality of 2 people who keep finding more to say. Nothing I would call certain yet, but something real, something that arrived without the weight of managed expectation. And I've found that lightness is its own form of significance. What I've learned, and I offer this not as a lesson packaged for easy transmission but as the honest residue of a difficult year. I've learned that trust, when it becomes architectural rather than active, stops being something you are doing and becomes something you are simply assuming. I assumed the foundations of my marriage were sound because I had not examined them recently and nothing had visibly cracked. The engineer's error, the assumption that the absence of visible failure indicates structural integrity, doesn't. It indicates that you haven't looked recently enough. I've learned that loneliness inside a marriage is a structural problem, not a personal failing, and that the solution to structural problems is engagement with the structure, not construction of a parallel one. This is what I wish Diane had brought to me. Not because I'm certain I would have solved it, I'm not certain, but because the attempt would have been honest, and honesty, I've come to understand, is the only material that holds under real load. And I've learned, this is the part one hold most carefully, that the life on the other side of a structural failure is not lesser. It is different. It is built differently, more consciously, with better attention to the materials. The 6 o'clock runs. Noah's star charts at both addresses. Sophie's parallel art kingdoms. Catherine's views on ecological corridors that are more interesting than my own. Research suggests that nearly 1 in 3 long-term marriages faces a significant breach of trust. 1 in 3. I was one of them, and I want to tell you that the number is not a comfort and is not meant to be, but that it tells you something about the scale of ordinary human difficulty, and about the scale of ordinary human recovery. I am building something I can stand on. I am checking the load calculations this time. Thomas's resolution enacts the story's central metaphor with complete consistency. The engineer who reads structural failure as a professional category applies that same framework to the personal crisis and arrives at a conclusion that is neither impulsive nor mechanical but genuinely reasoned. The 6-week delay before filing, the methodical examination of the reinforcement or replacement question, the clarity of the January decision. All of these are the behavior of a man whose professional habits of mind have, in this instance, served him well rather than blinded him. The distinction between the two is important. In Part 1, Thomas's engineering mind failed him because he applied it only to external systems and not to his marriage. In Part 6, it serves him because he turns it honestly inward. Diane's acceptance of the divorce, the quality of a woman who recognizes the more honest outcome, prevents the resolution from being a simple victory narrative. There is loss here that is real and acknowledged, and the acknowledgement is part of what makes the recovery credible. Catherine arrives with the appropriate lightness of a genuine beginning. Interesting views, more interesting than his own, the conversations that keep finding more to say. Thomas's final statement, "I am checking the load calculations this time," is the story's most perfectly calibrated closing line. It returns to the professional metaphor not as clever wordplay but as the honest expression of a man who has learned, at real cost, what he should have been doing all along, and who is doing it now. Thomas Hartley's story is about the specific failure mode of the competent man, the person whose professional intelligence and methodical reliability create, paradoxically, the conditions for his own blindness. He is a man trained to detect structural faults in complex systems, who for years applied that intelligence everywhere except the structure he most needed to examine. The result was not stupidity but the particular vulnerability of someone who had organized his life around a set of foundational assumptions, about his marriage, about Carol's visits, about the ordinary Friday rhythm, and had stopped checking whether those foundations were still bearing the weight he placed on them. Diane's arc is rendered with genuine complexity. Her loneliness was real. Her desire to be understood without explanation, to feel rather than be fixed, reflects a genuine emotional need that Thomas's nature, careful, methodical, solution-oriented, was structurally ill-equipped to meet without deliberate effort. This does not justify what she chose. It contextualizes it. The choice to construct a parallel life rather than bring the problem to the marriage is the story's central moral failure, and the story holds it without excusing it. The children, Noah with his astronomical precision, Sophie with her crayon rendering of a mother facing away, are the story's most honest emotional witnesses. Children process what adults negotiate, and the story uses both of them at precisely the right moments. Noah's observation that his mother laughs differently, Sophie's drawing of the family with one figure facing elsewhere. These are the signals that cut through adult rationalization because they come from a position without the investment in any particular conclusion. What Thomas carries out of the year is not a formula but a practice. The engineer's practice of checking the load calculations on the things that matter most, applied now to human relationships rather than infrastructure. Trust that is architectural rather than active is trust that has become invisible, and invisible things cannot be maintained. The 6 o'clock runs, the consciously chosen furniture, Catherine's more interesting views. These are the materials of a life being built with the full quality of attention that the previous life was missing. Not lesser, different, built, this time with someone looking at the foundations.